The suburban neighborhood of Burbank, California seemed like a postcard-perfect place. Neatly trimmed lawns, smiling neighbors waving from their porches, and the laughter of children playing in the streets gave no indication of the darkness that would soon engulf one of its most respected families. In a modest, well-kept house at the heart of this community lived the Reyes family. Eddy, a former federal officer, Teresa, a beloved local teacher, and their two children, the embodiment of youthful innocence. To outsiders, Eddy Reyes was the picture of success and discipline. His tall, broad-shouldered frame and authoritative demeanor reflected the years he spent in a position of power. He was polite, always ready with a firm handshake and a smile that could disarm even the most skeptical. Teresa was his complement, a warm, kind-hearted woman whose passion for teaching extended to nurturing her family. Together, they were the couple everyone admired, the family others envied, but beneath the polished surface of their lives, cracks had begun to form. Teresa, who once radiated joy, had grown quieter over the years. She moved through her days with a forced smile, her once bright eyes dulled by something unspoken. In contrast, Eddy seemed more intense, his need for control manifesting in subtle but unsettling ways. Teresa's friends had noticed the change and voiced their concerns, but Teresa brushed it off with vague reassurances. "I'm fine," she would say, avoiding eye contact. "It's just work stress. You know how it is." However, Teresa's best friend Maria wasn't convinced. One evening, as they sat together on Teresa's porch, Maria pressed harder. "Terry," she began cautiously, "if something's wrong, you can tell me. You know that, right?" Teresa hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, she whispered, "It's not easy, Maria. Things at home, they've been hard." Maria reached out, her voice low but firm. "Terry, what do you mean? Is it Eddy?" Teresa's silence was telling, but she shook her head quickly. "I'm handling it," she said, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't worry about me." Maria left that evening with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. Something was wrong, but Teresa was too proud or too afraid to share more. At home, Teresa carefully tucked her feelings away, focusing on her children, her students, and her routines. But even routine couldn't shield her from Eddy's presence. His once charming demeanor had shifted to something more oppressive. He monitored her phone calls, scrutinized their finances, and questioned her every move. "What did you buy at the store today?" he asked one evening, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just groceries," Teresa replied, avoiding his gaze. Eddy nodded slowly, his silence more unsettling than any words. Teresa felt the walls closing in, her world shrinking with every passing day. She had contemplated leaving, but the thought filled her with dread. Eddy wasn't just controlling, he was unpredictable. Late one night after Eddy had gone to bed, Teresa sat alone in the living room. Her hands trembled as she typed a text to Maria. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she wrote, her heart pounding. She stared at the screen, debating whether to hit send. Finally, she pressed the button, then immediately deleted the message from her phone. Unbeknownst to her, Eddy had already sensed her growing discontent. He watched her more closely, his suspicions mounting. To him, Teresa's silence wasn't submission, it was defiance. And defiance was something Eddy couldn't tolerate. Teresa's days began to feel like an endless loop of tension and fear. Every move she made seemed to be scrutinized by Eddy, his presence looming like a storm cloud over their home. She thought about their earlier years together, when he was attentive, caring, and the man she had fallen in love with. But those memories felt like distant echoes, replaced by a harsh reality she could no longer ignore. One afternoon, Teresa sat at the dining table sorting through bills. Eddy entered the room, his footsteps deliberate. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the weight of it making her flinch. "Why is the grocery bill higher this month?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge that made her stomach churn. "I bought extra supplies for the kids' lunches," she replied, keeping her tone even. Eddy didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "You're not hiding anything from me, are you?" Teresa froze. "No, Eddy, of course not." He lingered for a moment longer before walking away. Teresa exhaled shakily, her hands trembling as she resumed sorting the papers. But deep inside, she knew this wasn't sustainable. She couldn't keep living like this, walking on eggshells, constantly looking over her shoulder. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, Teresa opened her laptop and began searching for divorce lawyers. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing. What if Eddy found out? What if he tried to stop her? Despite her fears, she booked a consultation for the following week. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. A few days later, Teresa told Maria about her plan. They met at a quiet cafe away from prying eyes and ears. Maria listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. "Do you think he'll let you go that easily?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Teresa shook her head. "No, but I can't live like this anymore. I have to do this. For me and the kids." Maria reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You need to be careful, Terry. Eddie's not the type to let things go." Teresa nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know, but I have no choice." The following week, Teresa went to the law office, her heart pounding as she parked her car. She glanced around nervously, half expecting to see Eddie's truck lurking nearby. The lawyer, a calm and composed woman named Rebecca, listened patiently as Teresa explained her situation. "From what you've told me, Teresa, this isn't just a difficult marriage. This is control, and it's dangerous," Rebecca said, leaning forward. "If you're serious about leaving, you need to start documenting everything. Messages, conversations, even his behavior." Teresa nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'll do whatever it takes." But Eddie wasn't oblivious. He noticed Teresa's change in demeanor, the way she avoided his gaze and spent more time on her laptop. One evening, while Teresa was in the shower, Eddie went through her emails. His eyes narrowed as he found the confirmation for her appointment with Rebecca. The confrontation came swiftly. That night, after the kids were asleep, Eddie cornered Teresa in the kitchen. He slammed the email printout onto the counter, his face a mask of anger. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. Teresa's breath caught in her throat. "Eddie, You're planning to leave me?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "After everything I've done for this family, you think you can just walk away?" "Eddie, please," Teresa pleaded, her voice shaking. "I'm not doing this to hurt you. I need space." "Space?" Eddie barked a bitter laugh. "There is no space in this marriage, Teresa. You're my wife. You belong here." Tears streamed down Teresa's face as she tried to explain, but Eddie wasn't listening. His words cut through the air like daggers, each one laced with rage and betrayal. Finally, he stormed out, leaving Teresa trembling in the kitchen. That night, Teresa began to formulate a plan. She couldn't let Eddie intimidate her into staying. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a chilling thought crept into her mind. Eddie wouldn't let her go without a fight, and she wasn't sure she could win. It was an unusually quiet evening in the Reyes household. The children had gone to bed early, their soft breaths punctuating the stillness. Teresa sat alone in the living room, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Her heart felt heavy as she stared at her phone, the number of her lawyer saved but not yet dialed. Tonight felt different, darker somehow, as if the air itself carried an unspoken warning. Upstairs, Eddie paced the bedroom, his thoughts churning with suspicion and anger. The confrontation in the kitchen had left a bitter taste in his mouth, and every moment Teresa spent avoiding him only fueled his paranoia. His hands clenched into fists as he replayed their argument in his mind, each word slicing deeper. She was planning something. He was sure of it. Downstairs, Teresa finally worked up the courage to send a text to Maria. "I'm scared," she typed. "He's watching me more than ever. I don't know how much longer I can do this." She hit send, her hands trembling as she placed the phone face down on the table. Eddie's footsteps were sudden and sharp on the stairs. Teresa's body tensed as she heard him approaching, his heavy tread reverberating through the quiet house. He entered the living room without a word, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Who were you texting?" he asked, his voice low and cold. "No one," Teresa replied quickly, too quickly. She tried to maintain her composure, but the slight quiver in her voice betrayed her fear. Eddie stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. "Don't lie to me, Teresa. Let me see your phone." She hesitated, clutching the device tightly as if it were her last line of defense. "Eddie, you're being paranoid. It was nothing important." "Give me the phone," he snapped, his patience fraying. When she didn't move, he lunged forward, grabbing it from her hands. Teresa gasped, stepping back as he scanned the screen. His face darkened as he read the message to Maria. Slowly, he looked up at Teresa, his expression a mixture of betrayal and fury. "So you're scared of me now?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper but dripping with menace. "You think you can go behind my back, make me the bad guy?" "Eddie, please," Teresa began, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean—" "Enough!" he roared, slamming the phone onto the coffee table, the screen cracking beneath his hand. The sound echoed through the house, and Teresa flinched, her breath hitching as tears welled in her eyes. You don't get to play the victim here, Eddy continued, his voice rising. Everything I've done, everything has been for this family, and now you're trying to destroy it? I'm not trying to destroy anything, Teresa cried, her voice trembling. I can't live like this anymore, Eddy. I feel trapped. Trapped? Eddy's laugh was bitter, almost mocking. You're trapped because you refuse to see what you have, a family, a home, me. The argument escalated, their voices growing louder and more volatile. Teresa tried to walk away, but Eddy blocked her path, his presence overwhelming. Desperation clawed at her as she realized there was no escape. Not tonight. The next moment happened too quickly for Teresa to react. Eddy's hand closed around a nearby object, a heavy wrench he had left on the side table earlier after working on the garage door. His movements were almost automatic, driven by a surge of anger he could no longer control. "Eddy, stop!" Teresa screamed, but it was too late. A sickening thud echoed through the room, followed by an eerie silence. Teresa crumpled to the floor, her lifeless body sprawled beneath the dim light. The wrench slipped from Eddy's hands, clattering onto the hardwood with a hollow sound. He stared at her, his chest heaving, the reality of what he had done slowly dawning on him. For a moment, the house was deathly silent. Then Eddy sprang into action, his mind racing as he tried to piece together a plan. He grabbed a pair of gloves from the garage and began staging the scene, overturning furniture and scattering items to make it look like a break-in. His hands shook as he wiped the wrench clean, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of panic and justification. When he finally dialed 911, his voice was steady, almost rehearsed. "My wife's been attacked," he said, forcing a tremor into his tone. "Someone broke into our house. She's not breathing. Please, send help." As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, Eddy stood in the living room, staring down at Teresa's lifeless body. The reality of his actions weighed heavily on him, but he pushed the guilt aside. In his mind, he wasn't the villain. He was simply a man protecting what was his. The shrill sound of sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood, their echoes bouncing off the neatly lined houses. Red and blue lights bathed the Reyes residence as first responders arrived at the scene. Eddy stood at the front door, his face pale, hands shaking as he waved the officers inside. "She's in there," he said, his voice trembling just enough to suggest panic. "I found her like that when I got home." The officers entered cautiously, their eyes scanning the disheveled living room. Furniture was overturned, drawers left half open, and shards of a broken lamp littered the floor. But amid the chaos lay Teresa's lifeless body, a pool of blood surrounding her head. The scene was chilling, yet something felt off. One of the officers crouched beside Teresa, checking for signs of life. He shook his head solemnly and called for the coroner. Eddy leaned against the wall, his breathing uneven. "I don't know who would do this," he muttered almost to himself. "She didn't deserve this." Detective Sarah Collins arrived shortly after, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. A seasoned investigator, she had seen countless crime scenes, but there was something peculiar about this one. The chaos in the room felt calculated, almost staged, as if someone had gone out of their way to create the illusion of a burglary. "Did you notice anything missing?" Collins asked, her voice calm but firm. Eddy shook his head. "I haven't looked too closely. I was too shocked." Collins nodded, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before moving to the overturned furniture. She noted the absence of fingerprints on certain surfaces that should have been touched in a struggle. "Interesting," she murmured, making a mental note. As the team continued to process the scene, one officer discovered a pair of latex gloves in a nearby trash can. They were smeared with blood, and Collins's instincts kicked into overdrive. "Bag those," she instructed, "and get them to the lab immediately." Meanwhile, Eddy's account of the evening raised more questions than answers. He claimed to have returned home late after running errands, but when Collins asked for specifics, where he had gone, what he had purchased, his responses were vague. "I stopped at the store," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Just grabbed a few things for the house." "Do you have the receipt?" Collins pressed. "I must have thrown it away," Eddy stammered, his discomfort growing. Collins didn't let it show, but her suspicions deepened. "We'll need to verify your movements," she said, her tone neutral. "Just standard procedure." As the night wore on, more inconsistencies came to light. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices from the Reyes home earlier that evening, an apparent argument. One neighbor, Mrs. Jackson, recounted seeing Eddy's truck leaving the driveway shortly after sunset, well before the time he claimed to have returned. "Did you see anyone else around the house?" Collins asked. Mrs. Jackson hesitated. "No, but..." Eddy looked upset when he left, like he was in a hurry. By the time the forensic team finished their initial sweep, they had uncovered several puzzling details. The apparent point of entry, a broken window in the kitchen, showed no signs of glass outside the house, suggesting it had been smashed from the inside. Drawers that were ransacked contained items of little value, while high-ticket objects like a laptop and jewelry remained untouched. "Whoever did this wasn't here to steal," Collins muttered under her breath as she walked through the scene one last time. When she returned to the station, Collins reviewed the findings with her team. "This doesn't add up," she said, pinning a photo of Teresa to the evidence board. "The husband's story is shaky, the scene feels staged, and the timeline is inconsistent. We need to dig deeper into their relationship," a junior officer chimed in, holding up a bag containing Teresa's cracked phone. "We recovered this from the scene. Maybe there's something in her messages." Collins nodded. "Good. Let's see what she was trying to tell us." Back at the Reyes house, Eddy sat alone in the living room, his head in his hands. The flashing lights were gone and the house felt unbearably quiet. He glanced at the spot where Teresa's body had been, now clean but still haunting. His thoughts raced as he tried to convince himself that everything was under control. But deep down, Eddy knew the threads were beginning to unravel. Detective Sarah Collins sat in her office, a dim desk lamp illuminating the scattered papers before her. The evidence was piling up, yet none of it provided the final, irrefutable link she needed. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her focus. It was an update from the forensics team regarding the phone recovered at the scene. Collins quickly grabbed her coat and headed for the evidence lab. The technician handed her the device. "We managed to extract the data," he said, scrolling through Teresa's messages. "There's a lot of back and forth with someone named Maria. Looks like they were close." Collins leaned over, her eyes scanning the screen. The messages painted a vivid picture of Teresa's growing fear and desperation in the weeks leading up to her death. "I'm scared of him, Maria," one message read. "He's been watching me constantly. I can't even breathe without feeling his eyes on me." Another, dated just days before the murder. "I've met with the lawyer. I don't know if he knows, but I can't stay silent anymore. I need to leave." Collins sat back, her mind racing. The messages confirmed what she had suspected all along. Teresa had been planning to leave Eddy, and he had likely found out. But it wasn't enough to convict him. She needed more, something tangible that could tie Eddy directly to the murder. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While examining Teresa's personal belongings, an officer discovered a small locked journal tucked away in a drawer. Its cover was plain, worn with time, but the contents were anything but ordinary. The pages were filled with Teresa's thoughts, raw, unfiltered, and hauntingly revealing. Collins flipped through the journal, each entry like a window into Teresa's soul. The early pages described her love for Eddy and their early years together. But as the entries progressed, the tone shifted. Teresa wrote about feeling trapped, isolated, and afraid. "I don't recognize him anymore," one entry read. "The man I married is gone. All that's left is his anger, his control." The final entries were chilling. Teresa detailed the moments when Eddy's behavior became more overtly threatening. "He told me last night that I'd regret it if I ever left him. I believe him. I see it in his eyes. He's capable of anything." Collins's fingers tightened around the journal as she read one particularly damning entry. "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Eddy did it." That line hung in the air, heavy with implication. Collins knew she had found something significant, but it still wasn't enough. A journal could show intent, but it wasn't proof. She needed something more definitive to place Eddy at the center of the crime. Back at the station, Collins gathered her team. "We're close," she said, holding up the journal. "This gives us motive and context, but we still need the missing piece. Check everything. His emails, his bank records, his phone. He made a mistake somewhere, and we're going to find it." Meanwhile, Eddy was beginning to feel the pressure. The detective's questions were becoming more pointed, their visits more frequent. He tried to maintain his composure, but the walls were closing in. One evening, as he sat alone in his living room, he pulled out a bottle of whiskey, pouring himself a drink to steady his nerves. The journal had been taken from the house. He was sure of it. They were piecing everything together, and he had to stay one step ahead. But for the first time, he felt the weight of his actions bearing down on him. The facade he had carefully constructed was crumbling. Unbeknownst to Eddy, Collins was already zeroing in on him. As her team combed through his digital footprint, they discovered something startling. In the days leading up to the murder, Eddy had searched for phrases like, how to stage a burglary, and how to clean blood from wood floors. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the timeline of Teresa's final days. Colin's eyes narrowed as she reviewed the search history. "He planned this," she muttered. "This wasn't a crime of passion, it was premeditated." As she prepared her next move, Collins couldn't shake the feeling that the key to cracking this case lay in the details. Those small, seemingly insignificant actions that Eddy had overlooked in his arrogance. She closed the journal, the words of Teresa's final plea echoing in her mind. "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident." Detective Sarah Collins stood in the center of the precinct's conference room, the evidence board in front of her covered with photos, notes, and a timeline of events. The room buzzed with quiet activity as her team worked tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of Eddy Reyes' carefully constructed narrative. Collins tapped the tip of a marker against her palm, her mind racing through the inconsistencies that had begun to emerge. "The search history was the first crack," she said, her voice firm. "Now we need to find the hammer that breaks this case wide open." On her desk sat a neatly stacked folder containing Eddy's search records. How to stage a crime scene, how to clean up blood, and chillingly, how to fake a break-in. The searches were damning, and their timestamps aligned too perfectly with Teresa's last days for coincidence. Meanwhile, Eddy sat in the interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Across from him, Detective Collins entered with a calm but deliberate air, carrying a file thick with evidence. She placed it in front of her and leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "Eddy," she began, her voice steady, "I want to give you a chance to clear up some things. There are parts of your story that just don't add up." Eddy raised an eyebrow, his expression carefully neutral. "I've told you everything I know," he replied. "I came home, found Teresa, and called 911. That's all there is to it." Collins tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "Let's talk about that night. You said you were out running errands, but we pulled footage from a security camera near your house. It shows you leaving the driveway shortly after sunset and returning about 40 minutes later. Can you explain where you went?" Eddy hesitated, his fingers tightening around each other. I stopped at the hardware store," he said finally. "I needed supplies for a project in the garage." "Do you have the receipt for those supplies?" Collins asked, her tone deceptively casual. Eddy shook his head. "No, I must have thrown it away." Collins opened the folder in front of her and slid a sheet of paper across the table. It was a transaction record from Eddy's bank account. "According to this," she said, "there's no charge at any hardware store that night. In fact, there's no activity at all." Eddy's jaw tightened. "Maybe I paid cash." "Interesting," Collins said, her voice cool. "Because we also pulled footage from a hardware store you frequent. You didn't show up there, Eddy. So where were you really?" Eddy's silence was deafening. Collins let it hang in the air before continuing. "And then there's the gloves we found in your trash can," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Latex gloves smeared with blood. They had Teresa's DNA and your fingerprints." Eddy's face darkened, but he maintained his composure. "I worked on the garage earlier that day," he said. "Those gloves must have been from that." Collins raised an eyebrow. "You're saying the gloves, covered in your wife's blood, are just a coincidence? Eddy, this isn't looking good for you." Before he could respond, Collins added one more blow. "And then there's Teresa's journal," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "She wrote about her fear of you, about how she was trying to leave, and she wrote this: 'If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident.'" Eddy's composure cracked for the first time, his jaw twitched, his fists clenching on the table. "That journal, it doesn't prove anything," he spat. "She was always dramatic. You can't use that against me." Collins leaned back, folding her arms. "You're right, Eddy. A journal doesn't prove you killed her. But the gloves, the search history, the security footage, that's a lot of coincidences, don't you think?" Eddy said nothing, his gaze fixed on the table. Collins stood, gathering the file. "We're not done here, Eddy. I suggest you think carefully about your next move." As Collins exited the room, her mind was already on the next steps. Eddy's story was unraveling faster than she had anticipated, but she knew he was a man clinging desperately to control. He wouldn't go down without a fight. Back in his holding cell, Eddy sat alone, his thoughts racing. He had underestimated Teresa and the detectives. For the first time, a gnawing sense of dread began to creep in. The cracks in his story were growing, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The courtroom was packed with spectators, their faces tense as the prosecution prepared its next move. Detective Sarah Collins sat near the front, her eyes locked on Eddy Reyes, who sat stoically at the defense table. His attorney whispered something to him, but Eddy didn't respond. He seemed distant, detached, as though the weight of the evidence against him had finally begun to settle. The trial had been an intense affair so far, with the prosecution meticulously laying out their case. The journal, the search history, the gloves, all damning pieces of a puzzle that pointed directly at Eddy. But today, the prosecution promised to deliver the most explosive piece of evidence yet. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, standing confidently before the jury, "today, we will introduce audio evidence that further establishes the defendant's motive and intent. This evidence comes directly from the victim herself, recorded in her own home." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Eddy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening as the prosecutor turned toward the jury. "This recording was recovered from Mrs. Reyes's phone," the prosecutor continued. "It was made just 2 days before her death." Collins had heard the tape before. It was chilling, a stark reminder of the fear Teresa had lived with every day. She braced herself as the prosecutor nodded toward the technician handling the audio equipment. The room fell silent as the tape began to play. At first, there was the faint sound of shuffling, then Teresa's voice, soft and trembling. "Eddy, please, I just need space," she said, her tone pleading. "I'm not trying to hurt you." Eddy's voice came next, cold and cutting. "Space, that's your excuse? You think you can just walk away from this family?" "I'm not walking away," Teresa replied, her voice cracking. "I just need time to think." "Time to think?" Eddy's tone grew harsher. "You don't need time to think, Teresa. You need to remember what's at stake here. You leave, and you'll destroy everything. The kids, the house, everything." There was a pause, and then Eddy's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "If you think you can leave me, think again. Over my dead body." The tape ended abruptly, the silence in the courtroom deafening. Several jurors exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. Eddy's attorney stood, his face pale but resolute. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice strained. "This tape is highly prejudicial and lacks proper context." The judge frowned, considering the objection for a moment before shaking his head. "Overruled. The jury will consider this evidence as presented." Eddy's attorney sat down heavily, leaning toward his client. "We need to reframe this," he muttered. But Eddy didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the table, his hands clenched into fists. As the prosecution continued their case, the tape lingered in the minds of everyone in the room. It wasn't just the words Eddy had spoken. It was the tone, the venom behind them, that made the threat undeniable. For the first time, the jury could hear the fear in Teresa's voice, the desperation of a woman who knew her life was spiraling out of control. Outside the courtroom, Collins stood with the prosecutor, her expression grim. "That tape will stick with them," she said quietly. "It's the closest they'll ever get to hearing her side of the story." The prosecutor nodded. "It's powerful, but we can't let up now. Eddy's defense will try to spin it, make it seem like a heated argument instead of a prelude to murder." Collins glanced back toward the courtroom doors. "They can try," she said, "but I think this jury knows the truth." Inside, Eddy sat alone at the defense table as the courtroom began to clear for a brief recess. He could feel the walls closing in, the evidence mounting against him with every passing moment. The tape had been the most damning blow yet, a recording of his own words sealing his fate. For the first time, doubt crept into Eddy's mind. Could he truly maintain control, or had he already lost everything? The tension in the courtroom was palpable as both sides prepared for closing arguments. Eddy Reyes sat at the defense table, his face a mixture of defiance and apprehension. The weight of the evidence against him was undeniable, but his lawyer had spent hours crafting a narrative to sow doubt in the jury's minds. It was his last chance to salvage the case. The prosecution was first to speak. The lead prosecutor, confident and composed, stood before the jury and began methodically dismantling the defense's arguments. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he started, his voice steady and measured, "this case is not about assumptions, it is not about speculation, it is about evidence, and the evidence in this case paints a clear picture of what happened on the night Teresa Reyes was murdered." He gestured toward the timeline projected on a screen behind him. The defendant, Eddy Reyes, planned this crime. His internet searches showed premeditation. His actions after the murder, staging the scene, disposing of evidence, proved his intent to deceive. And most damning of all, The words captured in Teresa's own recording showed his capacity for violence. The prosecutor paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Teresa feared for her life. She tried to escape, but Eddy would not let her go. And on that fateful night, he chose control over compassion. He chose violence. He turned toward the jury, his tone softening. Teresa's voice is no longer here to tell her story, but the evidence speaks for her. It is your duty to ensure that her story ends with justice. When the prosecutor finished, the room was silent. Eddy's attorney rose, his expression firm but strained. He approached the jury, attempting to exude confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case is built on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. Yes, the defendant argued with his wife. Yes, their marriage had its challenges. But an argument is not murder. A heated moment does not equate to premeditation." He gestured toward Eddy. "My client is a man who has lost everything, his wife, his family, his reputation. And now, he stands accused of a crime he did not commit. The prosecution wants you to believe he is a monster, but I urge you to look at the facts. Do they truly prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Eddy Reyes committed this crime?" The defense rested its case, and the judge issued final instructions to the jury. As the jurors filed out to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with subdued whispers. The trial had been exhaustive, the evidence overwhelming, but the defense's arguments left just enough room for uncertainty. Hours turned into a day, then two. The waiting was agonizing for everyone involved. Colin spent the time going over the case in her head, questioning whether they had missed anything. But deep down, she knew the jury had all they needed. On the third day, the jury returned. The judge called the court to order, and everyone rose as the foreperson delivered the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Eddy Reyes, guilty of murder in the first degree." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Teresa's family, seated in the gallery, began to weep. Maria, her closest friend, clasped her hands tightly, tears streaming down her face as relief and sorrow mingled. Eddy's expression hardened, his jaw clenched as the judge pronounced the sentence: 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a severe punishment, but one the prosecution had argued was necessary to ensure justice for Teresa. As Eddy was led away in handcuffs, he cast one final glance toward the courtroom. It was not a look of remorse, but of resentment, a man who had lost his battle for control and now faced the consequences of his actions. Outside the courthouse, Colin stood with the prosecutor as reporters swarmed them for comments. She spoke briefly, her voice measured but resolute. "This verdict will never bring Teresa back, but it sends a message. Domestic violence and control are not private matters, they are crimes, and they will not go unpunished." Later that evening, Collins returned to her office. She sat alone, the weight of the case pressing heavily on her. The journal, the tape, the evidence, they were all pieces of a puzzle that led to justice, but they couldn't erase the pain or the loss. Teresa's children would grow up without their mother, and Eddy's actions had shattered the lives of everyone who loved her. Justice had been delivered, but the scars left behind would take a lifetime to heal. Collins closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Cases like this always left a mark, but they also served as a reminder of why she did what she did, to give a voice to the voiceless and to ensure that even in the darkest moments the truth would prevail. The courtroom had emptied, leaving only silence in its wake. The echoes of the verdict still lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the trial. Outside, the media frenzy had erupted, reporters scrambling to capture every detail of a case that had gripped the community for months. But for those closest to Teresa Reyes, the end of the trial was not an end at all. It was the beginning of a new, haunting reality. Maria sat in her car, parked a few blocks from the courthouse. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, her grip firm as she stared blankly ahead. The justice system had done its part, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed her friend. Teresa had reached out, pleaded for help, and yet the warnings had gone unanswered until it was too late. "I should have done more," Maria whispered to herself, tears welling in her eyes. She replayed their last conversation over and over, Teresa's voice trembling with fear. Maria had encouraged her to stay strong, to hold on just a little longer, but the weight of Eddy's control had been too much for Teresa to bear. Back at the Reyes home, the once vibrant house stood eerily still. Teresa's children were staying with relatives, their laughter and chatter replaced by an oppressive silence. The living room, where so many family memories had been made, now bore the scars of a life shattered. A framed photo of Teresa and her children still sat on the mantle, a painful reminder of the love that had been stolen from them. Detective Sarah Collins found herself returning to the house one final time. The investigation was closed, and Eddy was behind bars, but something about this case lingered with her. As she walked through the quiet rooms, she couldn't help but think about the countless others who lived in silence, trapped by fear and control. She stopped in Teresa's bedroom, her eyes falling on a box of belongings the family had left behind. Inside, she found an unfinished letter addressed to Maria. The handwriting was shaky, the words raw with emotion. "Maria, if something happens to me, please take care of the kids. Tell them I love them with everything I had. I tried to protect them, but I don't know if I can anymore. I'm scared, but I'm trying to be brave." Collins folded the letter carefully, her chest tightening. Teresa had fought so hard to escape, but the system had failed to protect her in time. It was a harsh reminder of the gaps in justice, the cracks through which victims like Teresa so often fell. Months later, the community of Burbank gathered at a local park to honor Teresa's memory. Friends, family, and even strangers lit candles, their flickering flames a symbol of resilience and hope. Maria stood at the front, clutching a photo of Teresa, her voice trembling as she addressed the crowd. "Teresa was more than a victim," Maria said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "She was a mother, a teacher, a friend. She loved fiercely and gave everything she had to those around her. But she deserved better. She deserved safety, freedom, and a chance to live her life without fear." Maria paused, her voice breaking. "We can't change what happened to Teresa, but we can fight for those who are still here. We can listen, we can believe, and we can act before it's too late." As the candles burned low, the crowd stood in solemn silence. The pain of Teresa's loss was a weight shared by all, but so was the determination to prevent another tragedy. In prison, Eddy sat alone in his cell, staring at the blank walls that now confined him. The reality of his sentence had sunk in, but it was not remorse that filled his thoughts. It was bitterness. He had lost control, and with it, the life he had once commanded. For Eddy, the years ahead would be a slow reckoning, a lifetime spent facing the consequences of his actions. For Detective Collins, the case of Teresa Reyes would remain etched in her memory. It was a victory for justice, but not one without cost. Teresa's voice, captured in her journal and recordings, had guided them to the truth. But Collins knew that for every Teresa who was heard, there were countless others who still suffered in silence. As she left the park that evening, Collins looked back at the glowing candles. They flickered gently in the breeze, each one a reminder of the strength it took to speak out and the responsibility to listen.